Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast, the podcast that is passing wisdom to the next generation of athletes, parents, and coaches to transform athletes into better leaders on and off the court. So, in our episode today, I, Coach Furtado, get an opportunity to interview PhD Mike Rucker. He is a behavioral scientist and psychologist, and in today's conversation, we talk about having fun. And so talking about the importance of having fun for coaches, for parents, how we can implement more fun into our daily routines. I talked a little bit about some of the challenges that I have with, making sure that I'm implementing fun into my daily life and so much more. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Bridging Impact Podcast, Mike. I'm really excited to have our conversation to talk about fun because I feel like it's something that, for those that are listening, right, coaches, parents, like oftentimes it can feel stressful, whether you're a coach trying to build a championship team or just trying to, teach life lessons to your kid while, making sure that they stay, sane and safe. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I want to dive right in and just ask, how did you, want to, dedicate your life to studying fun and what's the story behind that?
Yeah. So my origin story is I've been studying happiness for quite some time. I'm a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. And so I'd kind of, up until 2016, I kind of got into that space right at the turn of the millennium. And I'd really been, looking at happiness and ideas from positive psychology. But long story short, unfortunately, in 2016, I had a couple events that weren't so happy. So my younger brother passed away unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism, and I had been a runner up until that point. And these two aren't related at all, but also during that same year, found out that I had likely had an injury that had gone unnoticed and was going to need a hip replacement. So my career as a runner was essentially over. And so these two big sort of identity shifts were a real challenge. But up until that point, I'd been kind of Pollyanna about life, and so was trying to use these tools of, gratitude and optimism to sort of pull myself out of the malaise of that time, and found that paradoxically, and now this is backed up by research, and we talk about things like positive, toxic positivity and things of that nature, but that having an overemphasis on always trying to be happy is actually paradoxically one of the best ways to become unhappy. And so, here was sort of this awakening, like, the way that I had sort of been living life in this moment, at least, was problematic. And so, if chasing happiness per se wasn't a good way to sort of invite, a joyful experience in what was. And so I started looking at the construct of, just mindfully having fun, mindfully enjoying your experiences despite your sort of emotional state. And once I got a kind of taste for that, I was off to the races. And so I paired that with an understanding of how people thrive when they have a sense of autonomy. So like when we have control over how we spend our time and we're doing it in a way that we feel like we have control over our domain, we tend to have more vigor and vitality. And then also from behavioral science, we just know that when people are enjoying things, they tend to be more engaged, right? And so I certainly see that all the time. I have two small children, and, I think you tell me, but like, good coaches make things fun for kids so they want to do it instead of, right, the old way when I was a kid, double days and things of that nature, where it was kind of, you saw a lot of people quit because it just, they were kind of trying to weed that out. We just know that you're going to get a broader population of people wanting to do the thing if it's enjoyable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely see it. And especially for the, young basketball players and kids that I work with that may not be, they're not pursuing basketball seriously, but they have a coach who's, taking it seriously and, wanting them to do things super right. And instead of just like making things like an enjoyable experience about like learning how to move. Right. Because I think that's part of the reasons maybe that the PE teacher kind of coach brain in me is like wanting to help kids have a healthy relationship with physical movement, which is just so important to health. But going back to kind of your point, I want to kind of unpack a little bit on this notion of chasing happiness actually makes us less happy. I'm curious, what does some of the research say, and how can we start to like reshape and reframe, you know, from chasing happiness to just mindfully, pursuing fun more.
Yeah, absolutely. So it the crux of the problem is in the rumination, right? And so essentially, when you're chasing happiness, and especially because I know, for folks that are working with kids, like this problem is just increasing in its complexity, because people are comparing what happiness is to really curated pictures of it on social
Mm,
media, right? And so when you don't identify with whatever you think the ideal of happiness is, then you create this cognitive space, right? Sometimes we call it dissonance, between where you think you should be and where you actually are, right? And so real enjoyment is where your feet are, right? But once you get in this trap of sort of, okay, I just need to get here and then everything will be okay, you start to burn energy that you could be using for other things in a state of rumination. And we just know, we call that sort of poor mental hygiene. Once you get stuck in these rumination, spirals, then one, you're using that time not to have fun, right? And then you start to slowly but surely, your subconscious starts to identify as not being happy, because you're like, okay, well, everyone's sort of, in this artificial space over here, and that's supposedly where happiness lies, right? And I'm here. And so once you start to identify as unhappy, then that's where you actually start to see like clinical outcomes, right? We know that, you start to limit your focus, and you start to say, I just must be an unhappy person. And then you start to find ways to sort of back up that bias, right? And so by having a bias towards fun in the way that I describe it in my book that just came out, it's it's more of a leading indicator, because you're trying to find ways, even if you're not in an emotional state where you want to classify yourself as happy, you're doing things that you enjoy, and happiness becomes an interesting byproduct of that, because you're like, oh, life's kind of, by my own design, and it's in a way where I'm enjoying the things that I do, versus looking for it in the rearview mirror. So where happiness is really this act of evaluation, fun is really just enjoying where your feet are. And so in that way, it's sort of this form of mindfulness with this added component of realizing that you have agency and autonomy of how you spend your time. Now,
mm,
I know your slant is coaches. You have the opportunity as an adult to create those experiences for others, right? So like, what is it that I can do to create an experience that actually attracts the behavior that I want, because I'm doing it in a way that's fun, right? Like, from the coaching world, I think Pete Carroll is an amazing example of this, right? You hear of the relationships that he's had. You can criticize his, if you put him against Belichick or whatever, right? Whether or not
yeah.
he may not win all the time, but when you hear people talk about how he's had an impact on their life, which you kind of alluded to earlier, like those stories are enriched, and those relationships, the bonds that he created are way going to be have a longevity of impact, where you hear people talk about Belichick and they're like, I'm just glad that's over. Right.
Right. Right. They won a championship, but it's over now.
Yeah.
Before we kind of dive into, Pete Carroll, and actually, so I think there was a podcast, one of the ones that was kind of getting me into coaching. It's called the Flying Coach Podcast. It was with Steve Kerr and Pete Carroll. And Steve Kerr, it's a similar way in Golden State. Actually, one of their values is joy. But before diving into that, because I want to make a comment, because I'm guilty of the rumination of like, even like now, like, so part of what I'm doing with Bridging Impact, I'm actually building out like a basketball and leadership like training programs and like camps, clinics. And, I have this rumination, oh, once this is my full-time job, then that'll be enough. Right. And as I hear you, you talk, and I've heard, the sayings about being where your feet are, but I've never kind of thought of it as like, not a waste of energy, but yeah, a waste of energy of like constantly thinking about the future, and like when the future is here, then I'll be, happy. But like in realization, like I should just, be thrilled and excited and try and implement that fun that for the kids that I am coaching right now and substitute teaching when I, get those opportunities.
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack there, right? One, like clearly if there are big heady problems, you're not meant to enjoy yourself the whole time, right? Like again, that's
Right.
another interesting, happiness wasn't meant to be ever present or we wouldn't pursue, right?
Right.
Like, we would essentially just sit on the couch and have big old smiles on our,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
maybe that exists, somewhere outside of this reality, but that's not the one we live in, right? So, one of the neat aspects about fun is it's meant to be ephemeral. And that also helps you, when you understand that, know that any sort of painful experience that's going to happen, right? There's going to be loss there, like in games, you're going to, there's going to be a game that it was so close, so it's going to hurt. And like to say, don't let that hurt again, falls in that realm of toxic positivity. Let it hurt, right? We want to build that breadth of emotion so we have the resilience to deal with life's slings and arrows, as it were. But also with regards to good mental hygiene, give yourself that space as long as it's compartmentalized to reach your goal, right? Like have, say, whatever it is, this is arbitrary, right? But like Thursday, 3 to 4:30, that I am going to worry about that because I do want to move myself forward. Like, what are the things I need to do? How do I, whenever you do your kind of evaluation, what are the things that I need to do? But to your point, overly focused on the outcome, right? Kind of using happiness as a broad metaphor where it's like, when is happiness going to arrive? Over rumination on that is where things get problematic. So worrying about the outcome, like, and being considerate about how you want to move yourself forward, like there needs to be time for that. So how do you hold those two in the same space and feel comfortable about it, right? Is kind of the secret sauce.
That is a secret sauce, and I'm guessing it's an art, right? There's no like science definition of like critical thinking. Like every Sunday, I'm going to reflect, and then Monday through Friday, I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to ruminate at all. Like I wish it was that easy, right? But to your point, I think it's a good point to make sure that it's obviously it's not always going to be, I can't just snap my fingers and here's 100 kids coming to my camp. Yay. Like it does take, that strategic planning and thinking and, maybe it's not like quote unquote happiness, but I am taking steps towards that. But at the same time, just not over ruminating, when I come home at the end of the day, after I'm done coaching, I don't need to like over ruminate, about, the next day and the next day and what I'm going to do. It's about kind of building that intentional fun time after.
Yeah, two ways to circumvent that I found is one, how can you build in shorter periods to celebrate? Like instead of really worrying about something that's too far out in the future, like what is a milestone that is achievable within a shorter amount of time? And then once you hit that, celebrating it, like, okay, this is just another piece of evidence that I'm on the right path, right? Um, and then with regards to rumination, if you find that you're just going to old scripts, so it's not necessarily something, where you're putting together a plan to move yourself forward, but it's just wondering why you haven't gotten there yet, like you can figure that out. And so some people need that, some people don't. I'll be honest, I'm one that like wants to give myself the ability to have that anxiety because sometimes I find insight comes from that. But after like 30 minutes, it becomes unproductive. So as geeky as it sounds, I'll actually schedule that. Like, because I want to, so it's a adjacent example, but I do want to know a little bit about what's going on in the world, even though I really can't affect it and it doesn't affect me that much. So, what we call doom scrolling, right? Like I do
Right.
want that in my life. So I literally put that on my calendar and say, okay, for 30 minutes, I'll allow myself to get anxious by the news and then I move on, right? And it fulfills that. So I think what happens is that a lot of times it becomes insidious when we don't make it time bound, right? Then that's the problem. Like, holy shit, I let this ruin
Yeah.
my whole night, Hopefully there are no kids listening. I apologize, or at
Yeah.
least
No,
bleep.
no, you're good. Yeah.
So when it's not time bound, right? When essentially you've let it now take over, that's the bumper rail to look for. Because you're exactly right. Some people will need more. Some people, it will be more problematic. So just figure out how much time you need, and then make sure you cap it so that you can kind of move on.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point into transition into, how can we, talk about, implementing more fun into our lives, like daily, kind of. I'm thinking about, especially for me, and I'm sure even like as a professor, you've written books, and you're always putting out research, and there's like these big looming projects that you're always working towards. But and so that's what I feel like one of the things that, kind of what I was talking about a little bit before, as an entrepreneur, feels like we're never finished, right? And I feel like it's
That's
probably
right.
most people feel like that.
Well,
um
and I don't think it's a feeling. I think it's the truth. Yeah.
yeah, it is the truth. It's a feeling. It's the truth. How can we make sure that we're still, having fun and like actually, for it's corny and cheesy, but like enjoying the journey and the process?
No, it's not cheesy at all. So one of the things I talk about in the book, that was when I stumbled upon it, I realized like, okay, this is beyond just behavioral science. This is something that, is clearly really problematic, especially here in the US, is a
Hmm.
concept called the hedonic flexibility principle. And so much of our self-worth is tied to if we believe that we're productive, right? And especially if you're an entrepreneur. I think I got this from the E-Myth Revisited, but like, that joke that if you're an entrepreneur, you pretty much hate your boss, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
because you're
that's
your boss.
funny. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, um, but getting back to the hedonic flexibility principle, when you look at entrepreneurs and high achieving people, the ones that are able to be the most productive are the ones that are taking some time off the table for themselves, right? And so in this study, it had a big sample size, 28,000 people. It comes from Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. They looked at how people were spending their time. And no surprise, the people that were burnt out, right, weren't really enjoying what they were doing and how they were going about it. When they did have some leisure time, they were looking for, ways, what we call passive leisure, in the literature, things like social media use,
Mhm.
using drugs and alcohol, recreationally, things like that, things that aren't leading to your betterment. The folks that were engaging in active leisure, so having fun in ways that really filled them up, so maybe a hobby that led to betterment, maybe engaging in sport because that was one on the survey, engaging with friends, so actually prioritizing connection with others. They were the ones that were able to show up the next day with more vigor and vitality to do the hard things. So not only were they more paradoxically more productive, so they actually got more stuff done, they were actually enjoying the things that they were doing. And there was also the added benefit that they seeked out harder challenges. So it was actually additive, right? Because they had their fun cup was full, right? That's how I put it.
Yeah.
And that was an invitation of like, okay, I feel good, so what's the next challenge? So not only are they more productive, they're actually enjoying the way they spend their time, and they're actually seeking out ways for betterment to do things that are a little bit harder. So it creates this upward spiral instead of the downward spiral that so many of us find ourselves stuck in, right? I mean, you know I keep spouting out stats, but I don't need to anymore. I mean, it's all out there, right? Like on LinkedIn, every week now we're seeing, record numbers of burnout. We're talking about loneliness a lot because there's been a couple of good books, come out about how loneliness, isn't just a psychological issue. It leads to physiological poor outcomes, right? So all these things, like if we're not taking some time off the table to connect with the people that we enjoy and the things that we like doing, we're not the best versions of ourselves, right? And so making sure you prioritize that becomes extremely important if you want to be a productive entrepreneur.
Absolutely. And one of the books I read early last year, Together by Vivek H. Murthy, I don't know if you've read it, but it was one of those that really like connected and resonated with me because we're kind of coming out of early 2021 is coming out of the pandemic a little bit. And, like I definitely had isolated myself quite a bit more. Part of it was entrepreneurial and I graduated college. So I'm like not as close to my friends anymore. And then, it's just like with the pandemic, it just seems like I got disconnected. And that book kind of like, give me another, understanding of like, okay, connections like with people is actually like a really good beneficial thing, because you can fall into these kind of, what you're talking about, especially as Americans, entrepreneurs, like, oh, I just got to work all the time and be always grinding. But really like
like you say, like I notice on Mondays I have the most energy. I wonder why, because on Sundays I'm like, or Saturdays and Sundays, like I'm taking time for myself to spend time with my friends, my girlfriend, and like do stuff for myself. And it's that I just have to make it more of a habit to do that during the week too.
Yeah, figuring out what are those breaks. They call them transition rituals. You know, e- every time you're able to find some space, right, to kind of reclaim the agency over how you have your time, you're able to come back again with your batteries recharged. So sometimes I like to liken it to how, in the 90s, we kind of championed sleep deprivation because for whatever reason, like that's when it was the most insidious. And like, the Gary V's of the world, like,
Yeah.
if you're a true entrepreneur, then you're staying up, once you put your kids to bed, you stay up till 2, you wake up early. And like, and I don't villainize him because he's walked that back too. I think everyone knows how asinine of a suggestion that is now, right? Because if you're not
Right.
getting at least 7 hours a night, especially with all the focus on biohacking and everything like that, you just know that you're not productive. And we're finding the same about leisure now. I think if you're not enjoying at least 2 hours a day, even if that is like still enjoying your work, you're going to find that, slowly but surely you're going to, fall into that burnout category. And so hopefully you're finding, especially, um, you know, for folks that have more autonomy over their time, they're finding more than that. But, reclaiming at least 2 hours where you really can architect how you're spending that time becomes important.
Definitely. And, I would love to explore like what are some other, we talked a little bit about like passive leisure versus active leisure. And I feel like passive leisure is so easy, right? It's just like scrolling or as soon as you hit home, you turn on the TV. But what are some like good active leisure activities? You talked about it like sports, but I'd love to learn some more.
Yeah. So I've broken it up. I created my own model here. It's called the play model. And so, in what you're describing, I would say either falls. So, play stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding. And so, agonizing are the things that are really hard to do and that we don't like. Yielding is what you just described, right? Like, we're in some sort of state of discomfort and we just want to do something easy to displace it, but it's not really,
Hmm.
filling us up, right? Essentially, it's passive, it's to
Okay.
displace either boredom or discomfort. So active leisure can be something as simple as walking your dog, right? As long as you're mindfully doing it, you're enjoying that relationship. It can be what you just said, dates with your partner. It can be engaging in a hobby, um, all the way to things that do take a lot of energy, right? Like, anything that's kind of physically active. It could be a spiritual practice, it could be engaging in meditation, things that you find pleasurable, that you're attracted to, and then the spectrum really becomes how much energy are you displacing to do it, right? And so you're
Right.
going to want to balance, because things in the living quadrant, even though they lead to betterment and growth and transcendence at its best, it's not things that we can implement all the time, right? Because it does take energy away from us, and so you wouldn't want to do that all the time and burn out on top of probably already a busy schedule. So
Right.
how can you balance that with just things that you do enjoy? Because a lot of folks, especially like working parents, aren't even finding time for that, right? Like,
Right.
like I just got to work through the night. So again, using the example of walking a pet, they'll outsource that to their kids, right? Even though they really enjoyed that activity, right? And so reclaiming some of that time. And so one of the things that is the most important to understand is that most of the people that are kind of working through to the night is what science either calls busy work or admin work, depending on the studies that you're looking at. Those generally never move the needle forward. So they work episodically, like if you have a big presentation, or for folks that are in business development, they're getting ready for like a big sale or whatever. But if you're doing that habitually, most of the time, not only are you not really doing anything, you're essentially just clearing your inbox, which isn't really a task that amounts to much, but you're showing up the next day more tired. And so over time, you're actually you're a lot less productive than you actually would be if you actually had transition rituals and were using some time in the evening to refill your batteries.
So these transition rituals often are kind of the active activities and different things that help us transition from like our day, working through their day, and then enjoying the evening, and then also kind of what I talked about a little bit earlier with the weekends. For you mentioned a little bit about kind of blocking off that time for parents and making sure that it becomes a priority, especially for busy parents and coaches. Some may listen in, there maybe athletic directors, parents, and teachers, right? It's like, how do we do all of this? I'm curious, for those, do you have like any advice around how to make sure that there's enough time, like in our schedule, or how do we approach that?
Yeah. So the simple frame for me is that there's only 168 hours in a week, right? So
Right.
generally, if you can audit just a week, most of us think, we'll have like one or two things that are kind of novel within the week. And they're like, oh, but one week isn't like the next. Like for 95% of us, 90% of the week is going to be the same, right? So
Right.
paying attention to, even just a sample week, and then figuring out what are the things that you're doing in there. You can Google the play model, Rucker play model, if you want, to use that quadrant to kind of divide things up. But you don't need to use it. I mean, just look at how you're spending that time within any given week, and what are the things that you're actually finding enjoyable, and what are you not? Because last thing you want to do is add having fun to your to-do list, right? That's essentially
Right.
like, a facet of toxic positivity. Like, here, just do one
Right.
more thing. So
Yeah.
the first is, how can you clear some of the things that aren't, really leading to your betterment? And for most of us, that's where the low hanging fruit's gonna, lie. And if you don't believe me, like, just look at the health meter on your iPhone or Android, right? It's going to tell you, how much time you're spending in your email app and on Facebook and things of that nature. Um, so really, finding where are those opportunities where you could potentially do something different. And so that might not even be creating space, but things that you're already doing, and finding ways to improve them so that they are enjoyable. And kind of looking at your schedule creatively there, and then figure out what you want to integrate back in. And so what I suggest is, a little bit of premeditation, of creating a list of things that you do find fun. Because what we find, just as like, have you ever been with your partner and you're like, hey, what should we have for dinner tonight?
All
And
the time.
a whole hour goes by, right?
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so that same concept, as simple as it sounds, often happens to us, in our daily lives. And that's why we don't go out and do things that we enjoy, because the
Mhm.
easier choice is to just, watch another show on Netflix, right? And so if you have a premeditated list of like, actually, this, I want to do this thing, and even better if you can schedule it, then you start to get a taste of what it's like to actually live life. And so the first week, a lot of times people kind of do this in fits and starts. And so the first week or two of doing this, that sort of change in your schedule can sometimes be uncomfortable, because unfortunately we're habitual creatures, right? We just do like rhythms. That's, especially as we get older, it's more comfortable. We waste less energy, right? But once you actually integrate, quote unquote, a fun habit into your schedule, and check in with yourself, like, 2 to 3 weeks later, you'll realize that feeling that you have on Monday is apparent in more, more and more times, that like, wow, okay, so I thought this was going to be depleting because, for whatever reason, there's a whole host of headwinds that sort of, for some folks, it's guilt. For some folks, it's the exchange of, the allure of productivity during that time, even though they're going to be more, productive. So get past that discomfort, and then, actually enjoy your time, and then see how it makes you feel. And 9 times out of 10, if not more, people are amazed at how much more productive they are when they actually do start to take time off the table for themselves.
Right. It seems counterintuitive. It's like I'm just, relaxing, scrolling through. Like it's gonna make I'm gonna have to make more effort to do this, and but it does, actually, like we were talking about, those transitional routines, those active activities, do kind of like replenish us and fill us with joy. And I'd love to kind of shift the conversation towards. Do you have something you want to comment on that?
Well, I was just going to say, like, a baby step into this is checking in with yourself after, if you find that you've been on social media for an hour,
Mm,
check in with yourself and see if it did make you feel good. And like,
yeah.
almost everyone will realize, like,
No.
I don't feel invigorated. I displaced discomfort for an hour, but in no way did
Mm,
that recharge my batteries, right? especially for folks that do it right before bed. And you can listen to Otterman about this, right? Like, from the blue light to the dopamine hit you get from the variable rewards to the fact that you really should be sort of winding your prefrontal cortex down. Like, it's just not a good use of time. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. No, you're good. Actually, while we're on that, I'm just curious, like instead of like scrolling and watching TV before bed, like what are like some good like relaxing activities, right? Because that's one where maybe like playing a sport of basketball is probably not going to rewind you and reset you for bed. But I'm just curious what other like relaxing activities are.
Kids are a lot more resilient, right?
Yeah.
It's really clear, because I had some insomnia that physical activity right before bed isn't good for what they call sleep hygiene. I think whatever sort of relaxes you and puts you in a joyful state. So for some, that'll be meditation. For a lot of folks, it's reading fiction. Generally, nonfiction isn't. I love nonfiction, so I hate this recommendation, but I know it's true. You get into a book that really starts to get, especially for entrepreneurs, right? Like a good heady business book, and like, and so anything that sort of calms you down, and brings you in for a landing, is important. Obviously, you want to start to dim the lights if you can, so those are the basic things. Like any way to sort of start to slow down your executive function, so that you can get but just so many of us don't, right?
Yeah. I know the same thing for fiction book or nonfiction books, right? It's like sometimes that's my only reading time, but then I don't always unwind. I end up getting kind of inspired and the mind's invigorated.
I'm the same way. That one was a hard one. And then like I was like, well, are audiobooks okay? And like, no, It's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
If not even worse, because then you start to like pause it and write notes and anyway, I know we did get off the rails a bit, but yeah, like I feel you on that one, because I'm not a big fan of fiction, and but because of that, like I'll read one page and get sleepy because
you're not as focused on it. I'm the same way for sure. One of the things I was going to transition into is kind of going back to what you were talking about with Pete Carroll and just like building those relationships. And the Bridging Impact podcast is, yes, we want to help coaches, build championship experiences for, their athletes. But I think to us, the more important thing is to impact, their athletes and the kids on and off the court. And everyone stops playing, right? Michael Jordan's not playing basketball anymore, right? So what are, some different, ideas, tools, tips that coaches and parents can, implement into their, their kids, their athletes' lives to make sure that they're having more fun and kind of building those like, relationships?
Yeah, I think you just figuring out any of these experiences. One, you want to set a stage of what we call psychological safety, right? I think especially in kids sports, when you don't have that, inherently the kids are always going to be on guard, right? And so, whether you're in a coaching space or a working space, like starting there, right? Approaching the situation with some empathy so people feel like they have a free forum to express how they feel is an important start. And like, again, Pete is a great example of someone that does that, right? So that's kind of, you always want to talk about what are the preconditions for this to exist, and that's an important one. Then from there, like, how do you co-create an environment where it is enjoyable for everyone? So getting some buy-in from the kids, like, what do you guys want to do, or how do you want to solve this particular problem? It is, if you can find what that sweet spot is, then, that's great, right? Because then they all have buy-in, and it also is great for group dynamics. Then how do you add your own novelty and creativity to it, right? Like, so how can you approach any sort of drill or thing that you're trying to do with an amount of levity that is inclusive? And so every coach is going to know what that is for them. I certainly wouldn't want to prescribe it, but I think you can figure out ways that, make that particular activity a little bit less mundane, so that people, are attracted to it and want to do it. Like, when you look forward to do something, that just becomes a lot more powerful, right? And when things, the dark side of encoding sort of mastery is it being a little bit scary, but generally that can happen in the games, right? So you're practicing, what you learned on the practice field, and then was it really fun? That's another great way for recall. So both of them sort of increased dopamine, this motivation chemical. Because, I talk about this in the book, but we now know that dopamine's role wasn't pleasure at all. It was actually excitement, right? Dopamine gets released when we're kind of anticipating something really cool happening. And once you're able to elicit that either, again, through fun or fear, then the brain is sort of cued to encode a richer set of information. And so you see, again, it's a gentle effect, but that mastery, the path towards mastery can increase in those situations. So do you want to scare your kids or do you want them to have fun, right? I think hopefully most people choose the latter. And when you can do that, when the kids are engaged in memorable experiences, that's one way to create new skills. Now, I'm outside of my wheelhouse with regards to muscle memory and things like that, because I also understand, because I do have friends that are coaches, there is some merit in the mundane, right? There's this where it becomes sort of automatic. So a good mix of both, right? Like a lot of times people hear my message and they're like, okay, so this dude wants, my whole thing to be fun. That's not it. What you want is to create an environment that is enjoyable and inviting so that people are actually excited about what they're doing. To your point, especially for youth sports, right? So that people come back. I'm not talking about participation medals, right? I'm just talking about, to your thing, like I actually enjoy doing this. When I look back at it, I remember it as a fond memory and something that I want to do again.
Right. And I think one of the things that I've been learning is it's got to be a combination, right? Because, right, coaches are teachers as well, right? You have to teach a game. And I think one thing that I have been challenged with is kind of the art of what you're talking about, the art of teaching, the mundane, keeping their attention during that time, but also making the other part of practice competitive and fun and engaging for them so they can apply the mundane. And that's something that I'm still kind of working through and towards, because I know if you are teaching for too long, the mundane, it's just like, especially at the end of the day, which is when most coaches have practices, I feel like summer camp is probably the best time to teach, right? Because they're not overfilled with school and grades and friends. Because by the end of the day, I feel like it is like you really have to, pick those teaching points to go through, and then just kind of keeping it competitive. But I will really, obviously there is the cooperative coaches and like the dictator coaches, for lack of a better term. And you talked about psychological safety, which has been talked about a couple of times on this podcast. What are a couple of things that coaches, even parents, can do to make sure that their kid, their athlete feels safe, in practice?
Yeah, I think the main thing, and again, this applies across the board, we use the general construct of empathy, but I think a good gauge is that child willing to tell you anything? Do they feel, like if they were getting bullied, or if they're having problems with a particular aspect of the sport, do they feel comfortable enough to come to you and tell you about it? And that's generally a good gauge, right? Because that's where safety lies. The ability to share what we call emotional vulnerability is really, one of the most important constructs of psychological safety. So are your kids, do they feel safe enough to be vulnerable in front of you? And if you can answer that question, yes, great. If it's no, then what do you need to do? What steps do you need to take so that those kids actually trust you? And oftentimes it's just letting them know that you care about them, in an earnest way. Because kids, man, I mean, you probably see this. I did a lot of research for the book in children's museums. And, I don't know if it's mystical or what, but, emotional intelligence is so strong. Even in kids with like ADHD, they know when adults are full of it, where I think it's harder for adults to know when adults are full of it. Like kids their BS meter is an all-time high,
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think, they can sense whether you're authentic or not and whether you care about them or not. And I think it is kind of an interesting point, because I had the opportunity, I interviewed a ton of great coaches before, and like I'd coached middle school. This is my first year, like high school basketball is competitive, even though I'm at the lowest level right now. I still, there is still this like added extra standard and expectation. And so for me, it was kind of an interesting balance going from, because youth basketball, I just kept that strictly fun, but in high school basketball, right, like I'm, part of a program and building, and like we can't just run around and mess around like I was doing with the younger ones when I was coaching before. So it was kind of an interesting process for me to, keep them engaged, and especially, at a higher level. And I'm curious, for, I guess, because, we talk about Pete Carroll and Steve Kerr, it's obviously possible to be a coach who can, have a system of psychological safety and like have fun and joy in practice, if the Warriors and the Seahawks can do it too.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found interesting in the construct of, specifically work with kids is this idea of transactional analysis. So really letting the kids know when you're meant to be in teaching mode and when you're in a childlike state. And I think, using a transition ritual at a macro site, because you see even intense coaches, the ones that are beloved, like, okay, this now, it's time to clown around, right? Where like the kids are almost willing to do that as a reward, right? And so you can have like an intense practice if the kids know at the end that it's going to be fun, right? And so, there's some that integrate it throughout and want to make everything pleasurable, but like you saw Draymond Green, right? Like he even a place as loving as the Golden State, you're gonna there are gonna be problems, right? And so how do you create that environment? And for some, depending on your coaching style, it will be like, okay, so what is the mix? What is the mix where I actually I want the kids to know this isn't fun, this is meant to be a teaching module, and then what is the allure of that reward where we can potentially still move ourselves towards mastery, but they know that, hey, I'm going to be in a childlike state too. And you kind of whatever, either self-deprecation, there's so many tools, right? Humor, self-deprecation, actually getting out and playing with them and having some fun yourself if you're sort of at their level. Those are all interesting tools. One, this like creates an extrinsic reward. So it's just something I've seen because my background is in health and fitness as well, not in coaching, but I've seen be pretty motivating, and it doesn't like create an us against them. So it's sort of adjacent, but just like a kind of cool nugget is this idea of fishbowl reward. So if you're doing drills, where there's some sort of scrimmage, allowing the winning team to draw from a raffle and then get a prize. So you're not essentially, like stacking the deck. It's still this sort of variable reward. Can be a really interesting way to, create a fun environment too. And then, you make the prize goofy. But that like, it doesn't, again, create an us versus them environment. There's only one winner, and that winner is completely at random. Right. So, anyways, that's kind of a fun tool in a fun box, as it were.
Yeah, you're kind of giving me some fun ideas of, like, you make a good pass, right? Like, and you can kind of reward what you want to see, the fishbowl, and then in the end, right, like a fun prize, I don't know what it is, basketball, whatever it is, right? But I think that is a kind of a good, fun way to get kind of buy-in and, help you kind of pursue that mastery, but at the same time, make it like an enjoyable process, which is, I feel like a lot of coaches, responsibility in what they feel. And so as we kind of, reach the tail end of this podcast, I would love, for final thoughts on, how parents and coaches can implement fun into their life and for their athletes. And then where can people find, your work, your book, and just continue to learn more?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think the main thing is like looking for those opportunities where you can increase the amount of what we call, not to use a geek term, but hedonic tone, right? I think most people, we come, we're conditioned by the social norm to think that self-worth, has to be through the lens of martyrdom, right? Like if we're not, squeezing productivity out of every moment, whether that's, on the court or in life, that somehow that's going to erode our self-worth. And we just know that that's not true anymore, right? Again, read the book and you'll see like the science suggests that if you're not having fun, eventually you're going to exit either the sport or your domain of choice, right? So if you're looking at the long game, fun is almost a mandate. And so how can you look specifically at the things you're doing? Because ultimately you need to be the creator of what's enjoyable for you or the group that you're, managing, leading, or coaching. But figuring out ways to manipulate either the environment the activity itself. So maybe it's the drill or the way you're going about the game, or the people, right? Like elevating the folks that are fun, and kind of giving them more of a leadership role so that people are actually enjoying the time there, rather than, you see some, like folks that are clearly good at it, but maybe not leaders, create a toxic environment really quick, right? And so that would be a coaching specific recommendation. If you're interested in the science of fun, I write about it at michaelrucker.com, and my book's The Fun Habit. It's available wherever books are sold. So if you're interested, you can pick it up wherever you enjoy buying books.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I'll definitely have to check that out. I really appreciate your time. I got a lot out of it personally, and I always try and ask personal questions, because I know that the audience is obviously, whether you're similar age or different age, I feel like we all are experiencing different things, and I appreciate you sharing your insights and your stories today. I think fun is an important process, so because the world needs more great, obviously always need great parents and coaches and teachers, so we don't want to burn out. We want to make sure that we're able to bridge that impact. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. We'd love it if you would subscribe, leave a comment and a review on whatever platform you're on. It's the best way to help us grow. We appreciate you for doing that. We'll shout you out on social media. I'd also love if you connected with me on social media. Let me know your thoughts, and this is why I do it. I want to share knowledge and wisdom from experienced leaders to people like yourself and myself, so we can have this dialogue and move forward, make an impact on the world. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. Cheers.